I'm Taylor Grant, and I'm with my colleagues on the program Evening Edition, as we are each night at this time. Today's tragedy has touched us all very deeply, as it has touched all people everywhere. We're going to continue to monitor the CBS network so that you may remain as well informed as you have been since the disaster in Dallas occurred early this afternoon. While we do this now, however, ever ready to return to the network at an instant's notice, we have information and comment of particular interest to those of this listening area. This will include statements from leaders of our community and news service announcements, which I think you will find most valuable. I'm going to turn first to George Lord, if I may, who I believe has some of the statements that he himself has procured in conversations with some of the leaders of this area.
Yes, Taylor, I was in touch immediately with people in Washington, D.C., and as you may know, they were numbed by what happened in Texas. The office of Senator Clark had no comment whatsoever at the outset. The senator obviously near prostrate with grief, and I understood at the first contact with Senator Clark's office that he would have no comment, possibly until later in the weekend or on Monday. Senator Scott was on the floor of the Senate at the time. I might say, and I hope that this will be taken as it is intended, I do know that at the time after the president had been shot, but before his death had been announced, that Senator Scott, and I know too several other senators, were in their offices quite literally praying for his life. Senator Williams of New Jersey told us in this statement his feeling about the president's death. These are the words of Senator Williams of New Jersey. I am just stunned and grief-stricken beyond words. My heart goes out to Mrs. Kennedy and the president's family at this tragic, tragic loss. That bullet shattered not only the life of a great president, but shook the very foundations on which a free, democratic society stands. This nation, said Senator Williams, can endure all the flaws and perversities inherent in the frailty of human nature. But such a mad, senseless, and ultimate attack on the life of this nation's chief of state cannot fail to challenge our capacity as a free nation to govern ourselves as civilized men. If this tragedy teaches us nothing else, it must teach us all, every man and woman, to rededicate ourselves to the ever-vulnerable principles that separate civilization from the chaos of the jungle. That statement from Senator Harrison Williams. Senator Clifford Case, New Jersey Republican, told me this. Senator Case said, all Americans are one in mourning the death of our president, and as we share a common grief at the loss of a young leader cut down in the prime of life, our hearts go out to his wife and children with deep and affectionate sympathy. The Senate now, of course, is standing by in Washington, Taylor.
Thank you, George. Mike Stanley has also been in contact with many of those who have had some association in one way or another with President Kennedy in this community and some of our political leaders. And here's Mike Stanley.
Taylor, there was first this statement from Governor Scranton issued from his office in Harrisburg.
This hideous crime, with all its tragedy, leaves the heart and soul of America lifeless in sorrow. Pennsylvanians join all Americans in prayer for our president, his wife and his family, and for our nation. All the world stands still, stunned to silence by this evil deed.
That was Governor William Scranton of Pennsylvania. This statement from Governor Richard Hughes of New Jersey.
I share with my countrymen today a shock and grief which defies description. A young and fearless American has died in the service of his country, even as many years ago his body absorbed the wounds of battle in the name of freedom. Now John Kennedy belongs to history, and his courageous spirit joins the fellowship of those who never flinched in the doing of right and in the search for justice. May God bless him and his family and the America he loves so deeply. To President Johnson, now assuming the burdens of an office on which rest the hopes of all go the prayers and dedication of every one of us.
That Governor Richard Hughes of New Jersey. Philadelphia Archbishop John Kroll is in Rome attending the Ecumenical Conference. Monsignor Noon, Chancellor of the Philadelphia Archdiocese, had this brief statement.
It is a most sad duty to express the profound grief of the Archdiocese of Philadelphia over the tragic death of the President of the United States, John F. Kennedy. The priests and faithful sincerely mourn his untimely death, offer their condolences to his family and to all our fellow citizens, and join in fervent prayer for the happy repose of his immortal soul. The hurt to President Kennedy's person, to his family, to his high office, to our own country, and to the whole world is grievous and irreparable. He was, as we are proud to say, a good Catholic who sincerely served his country to the point of the supreme sacrifice. May his martyr's death have an ennobling influence on our nation and on mankind. We earnestly request prayers and masses, particularly on this coming Sunday, for the President and in expiation of the guilt and shame of this shocking event.
Monsignor Noon, Chancellor of the Philadelphia Archdiocese. From Dr. Eugene Carson Blake, stated clerk of the United Presbyterian Church and former president of the National Council of Churches of Christ in the United States, this statement on the passing of the President.
The assassination of President Kennedy is stark tragedy. Those who have been making irresponsible attacks upon him and his policies are as much responsible for his death as the one who pulled the trigger. Almost 100 years ago, a president was killed at an earlier crisis in the nation, not unrelated to the crisis in race relations of 1963. It is because the nation did not, after the Civil War, follow the just and generous policies of Lincoln that our nation is still torn in sectional and racial strife. I pray God that John Kennedy's death, tragic though it is, will be the turning point for which we have been working and praying, that the American people, in revulsion against all violence, hate, and bitterness, will move forward together into a new era and across a new frontier of freedom and justice for all Americans. Let each one of us now examine himself and assess his share in the basic cause of the violence that seethes under the placid surface of our common life. John Kennedy will not have died in vain if his death is the occasion of a new birth of freedom and the beginning of a renewed loyalty of all our people to the highest traditions of the Republic. There will be pious, bipartisan mourning. May there be equally pious, bipartisan action to set the nation forward to justice, equality, and freedom now.
Dr. Eugene Carson Blake, stated clerk of the United Presbyterian Church and former president of the National Council of Churches of Christ in the United States. The word of the shooting of President Kennedy hit Philadelphia City Hall like a bombshell, as it did virtually every other building and home across the country. Mayor Tate watched reports of the shooting in an office chamber, watching it on television. Following the confirmation of the death of the president, he entered the reception room to make an announcement to the crowd which had gathered there. Apparently shaken, Tate read from a prepared statement and augmented that with some extemporaneous remarks, quite emotionally shaken by the entire experience. The mayor said, "I am personally sorry and express my sympathy to Mrs. Kennedy, the president's family, father, and mother. I recall meeting him only 3 weeks ago during the political campaign when he spoke at Convention Hall and when my wife and I accompanied him to the airport. The president said he looked forward to returning to Philadelphia for the Army-Navy game and to his visit next year in Atlantic City, where he said he would enjoy bathing in the warm surf." This, of course, a reference to the National Convention of the Democratic Party. Mayor Tate said, "I've ordered flags flown at half-mast. I hope the people will pray for the repose of his soul. The death of President Kennedy, continued Mayor Tate, is a sin against humanity itself. President Kennedy was the world's leading spokesman of goodwill and tolerance for all men, of all nations, creeds, and colors. I call upon all citizens to pray for repose of his soul and let his untimely death serve as a beacon to guide them in their daily lives to practice those virtues which he exemplified. President Kennedy was the first Catholic president, and as a leader of the movement for tolerance, paid the penalty for his views. And Mayor Tate went on to say that the death is, of course, a great loss to the nation and the world, and expressed the hope that President Johnson will carry on with the tolerance and respect shown by President Kennedy for all men. Mayor Tate and City Council President Ortona, as well as certain other Philadelphia city officials, are at this moment attending a special Mass in memory of President Kennedy, which began at 5:15 in St. John's Roman Catholic Church near 13th and Market.
I must interrupt you here, Mike, for 2 or 3 reasons. One, first of all, I do want to remind our listeners that we are constantly monitoring the CBS radio network so that our listeners will not in any way be able to miss any news of further import.
Taylor, I just wanted to interject that I have been monitoring the CBS network, and the network has been doing very much what we are doing here, comment and reaction from around the world.
Thank you, George. And we are of Evening Edition, and our stations are WCAU and WCAU-FM in Philadelphia. Now, I also want to point out that while we do continue to monitor and are ever ready to return to the network should their news be considered more of immediate importance than ours, we have standing by ready to make some contributions to this program the former governor of Pennsylvania, George Leader, in our studios with us, and we will soon be talking on the telephone to a man who was quite close to both the president and, I should say, the late president and the new president. Mr. Albert M. Greenfield will be talking to us in just a moment or two. But, Mike, you were commenting about Mayor James Tate's statement, and I think our own John Clow was with Mayor Tate this afternoon, and I think John might have a word or two now.
Well, Taylor, as Mike has pointed out, City Hall was stunned and shocked with secretaries openly weeping. I went from the press room when the information was officially confirmed that the president had indeed passed away. And sometime later, when I was walking down the hall, I ran into the mayor, who was obviously and visibly shaken, in company with his cabinet on the way to attend the religious service which has just been referred to. We exchanged handshakes, and the mayor merely said it was a sad day indeed for the country.
It was an unforgettable day in downtown Philadelphia.
Yes, I walked through the streets sometime to and fro from different meetings. Literally, you could hear a pin drop except for the passing traffic. I went past the church of St. John the Evangelist and saw women and men both entering the church with tears running down their faces and leaving in deep solemn. The Negroes on the streets with tears running down their face, such as I have not seen since the day that Franklin Roosevelt died.
Thank you, John. Now, while we're waiting to talk to Mr. Albert M. Greenfield, Mike Stanley, I believe, has some announcements to make pertaining to, pertaining very directly to the way this tragedy has affected the lives of Philadelphians as they may have planned them this evening.
Well, Taylor, an audience at the Philadelphia Academy of Music was shocked today when Eugene Ormandy, conductor of the Philadelphia Orchestra, suddenly walked off the podium during a Friday afternoon concert. A few minutes later, an announcer appeared and told the audience of the president's assassination. Ormandy decided not to continue the concert, and the audience departed. Henry Peltier, orchestra manager, said the maestro was informed of the president's death by signals flashed from off stage. City Representative Frederick Mann today called the death of President Kennedy a tremendous and incalculable loss to America and the world. Mann said, "This is a deplorable thing. It is incomprehensible to think that in this country, in this day and age of a man who was doing the magnificent job Mr. Kennedy was doing, that he should be shot by an assassin. It's almost impossible to calculate," said Mann. And he said that the country has lost a devoted leader who, in his words, was guiding our path to lasting peace. Baptist churches and their 1,600,000 members of the American Baptist Convention were directed today to join in the mourning for the late President Kennedy. Harold E. Stassen, President of the Convention, and the Reverend Dr. Edwin Keller, General Secretary, sent the following telegram to the Convention's 6,000 churches. We request our churches to join in mourning the tragic loss of our President, and we ask all of our members to pray for God's guidance for our nation and for mankind at this sad hour. A message of condolence was sent to Mrs. Kennedy.
Excuse me, Mike.
I just wanted to interrupt for a moment to report to our listeners, Taylor, that it has just been announced from the White House that President Johnson will make his first official statement as president when he arrives at Andrews Air Force Base, which will be about 35 minutes from now.
Thank you. Mike, if you don't mind, we have Mr. Albert M. Greenfield on the telephone now, and before you continue to read the announcements of the various events which have been canceled this evening and tomorrow, I think we would like to talk to Mr. Greenfield. Are you there, Mr. Greenfield?
Yes?
I'm Taylor Grant, Mr. Greenfield, and gathered around this table with me are several friends of mine and yours, Mike Stanley, George Lord, and George Leader.
Oh, yes.
We have just been saying that you were indeed quite close to both the President and the Vice President. I guess it was just a short while ago that you saw the President, was it not?
That's right, about 3 weeks ago. When he came to Philadelphia, I was privileged to escort him to the Bellevue.
I am told, Mr. Greenfield, that he actually went out of his way during the dinner to get up out of his seat and come over to greet you that evening.
Yes, he did. He was very kind indeed and very considerate. He came to my table.
We'd be interested in hearing your views, Mr. Greenfield, at this moment, and not only with regard to the tragedy, of course, but with regard to your personal knowledge of Vice President Lyndon Johnson, who is now the President of the United States.
How can anyone speak? This is as much a catastrophe for the free world as nuclear war. What President Kennedy had already accomplished for the freedom of men throughout the world will live in history beyond our age. I'm heartsick for his wonderful wife and beautiful children. How can one speak of the great loss of a personal friend under such circumstances?
Well, thank you very much.
Not at all.
Mr. Greenfield, we do appreciate your talking to us. George Leader, you were a delegate at the convention. Permit me, of course, to say, as I'm sure everyone knows, but just by way of making formal identification, George Leader is the former governor of Pennsylvania, and perhaps noted as much or more for his humanitarian qualities as for his political successes. And George, I remember seeing you at the convention, and I suppose you could, if it is not imposing too much at this time of mass universal sorrow, to ask if you could recall some of the things that must come to your mind now.
Well, I recall very well, Taylor, the Sunday night preceding the Monday when the convention was to open. I remember the caucus of the Pennsylvania delegation. I remember the reaction there when at least some of the top leadership in the party indicated that, starting, of course, with then Governor Lawrence, that we might be supporting Senator Kennedy for the President of the United States. And, of course, there was all the reluctance that comes with an effort to elect the first Catholic president to this great country of ours. And I said then that there's certainly no reason why we shouldn't be supporting a man either because he was a Catholic or because he was young. And I thought Senator Kennedy had demonstrated the fact that he had the capacity to be a great president, and that we ought to support him. And, as you know, a large number of the delegates in that Pennsylvania delegation did support him. And I think what I said was true. Certainly his religion and his youth didn't take a thing away from his being president. In fact, it may have added to it. And I think that adds to the real sadness of this occasion, to see such a young man with so much to contribute to his country stricken down in his youth.
I remember the day, George, that it was broken to us, the news that his choice for second place on the ticket was going to be Lyndon Johnson. I remember that some of the reaction was not favorable, particularly among the liberals. The Michigan delegation was almost ready to walk out. I suppose because of the youth that you just mentioned, naturally no one ever dreamed that Mr. Johnson would succeed Mr. Kennedy. Do you have any particular comment on this?
No, I think it was kind of a reverse, kind of a switch, because you would have expected the vice presidential candidate, I think, after the Eisenhower-Nixon years, to be a younger man, and to be a man, in a sense, being groomed for the job. Of course, this wasn't true at all in the case of Lyndon Johnson, because either one of these men had spent enough time in the Congress and had seen enough of the world and knew enough of the world's leaders and the world's problems to be president. And unexpectedly, as it has occurred, both of them did become president.
Thank you very much, George Leader. I think at this point we had better return to Mike Stanley. George Lord, you are still listening closely to CBS. And
yes, CBS Network now is carrying, Taylor, analytical reports on what effect the death of the president may have on some of our policies, and explaining that it has been explained in the past several minutes that Vice President Johnson, on becoming president, immediately assumes all the prerogatives of that office, and that he will have to make his own decisions on which military chiefs he will wish to serve him. Every ambassador immediately submits a resignation. There is a great turnover in the whole area of government responsibility, and it emphasizes again, Taylor, the utter capacity for governing that a president of the United States has, that all of those who now serve the government are susceptible to being replaced, that they must submit resignations to this man who now stands at the head of our country.
Well, may I turn then to George Leader again before we get back to Mike Stanley and ask, George, do you feel that there are going to be any drastic changes? Do you feel that Mr. Kennedy and Mr. Johnson did become close over these years, close enough politically and philosophically perhaps, so that there may not need be any drastic revamping of our democratic process here?
I don't think there's going to be anything too drastic. I think it was Abraham Lincoln who said governments run by the motion men give them. And I don't think anyone could deny that President Kennedy had given this country great momentum, particularly in the field of foreign affairs. And naturally, it's going to, now when you've got to bring in a new coach and captain, a new leader, it's going to take some time to reinforce the structure to get this motion going. I think there's bound to be some delay, some lack of momentum momentarily at least, and I hope it won't be too long, and I hope it won't be too costly to the country.
All right, George, thank you. Now, I think if we may turn to Mike Stanley, there is information which I'm sure our listeners will want to have at this time.
Taylor, there are a list of many canceled events which are in the public interest to present at this time. However, if I might defer that for just about half a minute, we have received one further statement, this one from Rabbi Morris Pickholtz, the president of the Board of Rabbis of Greater Philadelphia.
Like all Americans, we are speechless and deeply grieved at the assassination of President John Fitzgerald Kennedy. We pray that God grant peace to his soul as we extend our sincerest condolences to Mrs. Jacqueline Kennedy and her family. Our fervent prayers are also with the new President of the United States, Lyndon B. Johnson. May God strengthen his hands in this hour of trial.
Rabbi Morris Pickholtz, president of the Board of Rabbis of Greater Philadelphia. Now, Taylor, at some of those events which are being canceled, all non-essential services of the YMCA of Philadelphia and vicinity will be shut down tomorrow in the morning for the morning of the death of President Kennedy. All 12 branches of the Y will suspend all physical education and social programs. Essential services for resident operations will be maintained.
All I can say, Taylor, is that I think that the impulse that the late president gave to the arts will not be lost. I think that his influence in the field of the arts, as in other fields, was particularly great and will continue.
Well, I'm sure then, Charles, that nothing better could be said in reward of his effort than that. I rather assume that there is considerable mourning among many, many great men of letters and of the arts everywhere. I'm thinking, of course, particularly right now of Robert Frost, who at his age, I'm sure, must have felt this terribly, terribly keenly today, because all of us who remember the inauguration will remember him.
I think this is a day when most artists, especially the artists with words, will be silent, Taylor.
I imagine you're right, Charles. But I suppose that one day soon, this too will give them some inspiration to write something truly beautiful and meaningful.
There have been some points raised, if I may interject for a moment, Taylor. During the discussions of the president's death in Washington, one point which has come up several times in the last couple of hours, not necessarily in broadcast conversations, but in privater conversations in Washington, that the United States may have to stay very much on its guard at this time. The new president, President Johnson, will meet very promptly with Defense Secretary McNamara, with Secretary of State Dean Rusk, and with others concerned with our foreign policy. Probably the National Security Council will be involved in this initial meeting, so that President Johnson can make an early assessment of what the effect of the president's death will be on our international policies, what effect it may have on our relations with other nations, with the communist countries, and whether there is any danger whatsoever of any nation, for any reason, endeavoring to take advantage of the unsettled condition of our government at this time. This will be one of the most immediate concerns for President Johnson.
Thank you, George. I understand that we are receiving many telephone calls from concerned persons who are anxious to know what is the proper thing to do with regard to one's flag that is on display. Here at CAU, I know that it was lowered to half-mast immediately. I believe that is the only answer, is it not, gentlemen?
That is correct. The flag should remain at half-mast until after the president's funeral, which will probably be, it is now estimated, next Tuesday.
We are not too terribly far away from that time on normal presentations of Evening Edition when we hear something from Joe Livingston. I hesitate, Joe, to suggest that we talk finances at a time like this. I'm happy to have you here, though, because of the fact that you could bring us some indication, I suppose, of what it must have been like at a great newspaper this afternoon when this happened.
Well, when this happened at the Bulletin, first news came and everyone immediately gathered around the news tickers, the AP service, the UP service, UPI, and the television set was turned on, and there wasn't a department in the Bulletin, the sports department, the women's department, the financial department, the feature department that didn't gather around. In the financial department, we were torn, and you might say, because we were concerned with what was going on in Wall Street, and we went to both tickers at once, both the Dow Jones ticker and the Associated Press and the UPI teletype message receivers. Naturally, at first we were not only stunned, but we were puzzled. What should we put in the paper? We didn't know whether the president had been assassinated. All we knew for a moment was that he had been shot. We waited and waited, and finally the terrible news came. And then, of course, the news came that stocks were down very sharply. First the ticker was 8 minutes late. The market had been going up, and then the Board of Governors met and closed the stock exchange. I was quite interested. I received 2 telephone calls from persons saying that the Board of Governors waited too long. They should have done it immediately. Why did they have to wait 15 or 20 minutes while an avalanche of selling inundated the market? However, you must know that the Board of Governors of any institution has to have a meeting. They have to talk things over. They can't act hastily. Too many opinions, too many voices have to be heard, and this is the reason for the delay.
Well, thank you very much, Joe, and we do appreciate your coming up here to contribute to our conversation this evening. I think Mike Stanley, Mike, before I turn this to you again, have we mentioned that classes at the University of Pennsylvania have been suspended, and at Temple? And
Yes, I did, Taylor, and as a matter of fact, there are hundreds, literally hundreds of events scheduled for tonight, tomorrow, and Sunday which are being canceled, and this list, frankly, at this point has grown much too long to be read over the air at this time, and I might suggest that persons who had any involvement in functions scheduled for this weekend or perhaps even early next week would do well to check with their program chairman or organization chairman to find out just what the plans are for those specific events.
That's a very good idea, Mike. I think we had better make sure that everyone does have that clear. Anyone who is...
If I may interrupt, yes. I think we might get back to the network, which is now reporting on the pickup of several suspects down in Texas.
Right away.
This is John Facenda in Philadelphia, adding to the tragic news of this day. We are prepared, ladies and gentlemen, to join the CBS network at any moment for more pertinent news as to this tragedy unfolds. At this moment, however, the new president, Lyndon B. Johnson, is on his way to the White House to assume his new responsibilities. The late President John F. Kennedy's remains are on their way via ambulance to the Bethesda Naval Hospital. The quiet class of Mrs. Jacqueline Kennedy was again expressed by her composure as she came down the rank of the plane that carried her husband's body back to Washington. The airplane bearing the body of the assassinated president, his wife, the new President Lyndon B. Johnson, and his wife, landed just a few short moments ago at Andrews Air Force Base in Washington. Former Vice President Johnson was sworn in aboard that same plane at 3:39 Eastern Standard Time before it left Dallas to become the 36th President of these United States. In Dallas, police are still questioning 24-year-old E.H. Oswald, identified as the chairman of a Fair Play for Cuba committee, as the top suspect at the moment in the ambush assassination. He's accused of killing a Dallas policeman in a theater after the officer chased him as a suspect in the murder of President Kennedy. He is said to be an employee in the building from which the president was shot, where they found the rifle, some empty shells, and the shoddy garbage left by the killer, the remains of some fried chicken. Oswald is said to have renounced this country and visited Russia. He is also, unfortunately, a former U.S. Marine. Another suspect is being held at Fort Worth, and several other possible suspects are still being questioned. And the United States and Mexico have closed their common border for 72 hours to prevent any possible suspects from fleeing into that country. The plane bearing Mrs. Kennedy was met by the late president's brother, Robert Kennedy, who greeted Mrs. Jacqueline Kennedy but needed no assistance whatsoever. Her composure was again characterized by her unsmiling countenance, but still in awe with a firm determination. This nation is shocked. Philadelphia is too. Most of the news that you've heard have originated from Dallas, from New York, and from Washington. Philadelphia has had not a moment to tell of its shock at the tragedy. We can say that the nation is numb, true. Philadelphia is burning with anger, too, and a little bit sick with the revulsion following the assassination of our president. Our war hero president was shot to death in a cowardly attack from ambush. He who survived the fires of a war in the South Pacific only succumbed to the berserk frenzy of a mind which must be disordered beyond all understanding. Hundreds of thousands of cheering Texans had welcomed the late president to Fort Worth, as well as to Houston. 250,000 persons in Dallas cheering the president in the motorcade in which he rode with the bulletproof glass bubble down, and the president, hatless, confident, and smiling, exposed. His wife and Governor John Connally were by his side, but on the fourth floor of a 5-story building along the motorcade route, there was one who waited with the fires of madness and hatred burning at what could be perhaps not called a brain. A fusillade of shots rang out, and a madman's bullet sped to the president's right temple. He died at 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time after receiving the last rites of the Catholic Church at Parkland Hospital 45 minutes after he was shot. Governor Connally was seriously wounded. Mrs. Jacqueline Kennedy cradled her husband's head in her arms and whispered, "Oh no, oh no." The nation knew then, even if they could not bring themselves to believe it, that their vibrant 46-year-old chief executive had finally set down the greatest burden on earth. The president's brother, Edward Kennedy, was presiding over the U.S. Senate when he received the tragic word, which was quickly spread across the chamber. Ted Kennedy left quickly. The Senate chaplain read a prayer as all the senators bowed their heads. Later, Senate Majority Leader Mike Mansfield had this to say.
The passing of John Fitzgerald Kennedy is not only a tragedy for the nation which he so ably represented, but is, I think, also a mark upon the respectability and the responsibility of some of our citizens. This good, this decent, this kindly man, this harassed man who had so much on his shoulders and received from some people so little in the way of support in return, this man has now gone to his reward. And I will miss him as a personal friend. The nation will miss him as a great president. And the world will miss him as a great leader.
Democratic Senator Mike Mansfield of Montana. WCAU, AM and FM in Philadelphia. You've just heard, ladies and gentlemen, the broadcast from Washington, D.C., as the new president of these United States, Lyndon B. Johnson, has left the helicopter that carried him from the Andrews Air Force Base just outside of Washington, along with it the remains of President Kennedy, and he is now in the Oval Room at the White House, burdened as he is with a tremendous responsibility falling on his shoulders so quickly, so tragically. As we understand at this moment, there is to be a nonpartisan meeting of the heads of all of Congress and the other executive branches of our government at 7 to 7:30. President Johnson is to preside at that meeting. The expressions of grief and shock and sympathy have already been most eloquent in various expressions. Some of them have been most inarticulate, but nonetheless, all of them were fraught with a tremendous shock at the loss of the vibrant 46-year-old President of the United States, John Fitzgerald Kennedy. We've been telling you some of the expressions. We've been hearing their voices. We have others that we carry on. This one, Democratic Senator Mike Mansfield of Montana, who spoke of him, said that he lost a personal friend, a great American, and a world leader. And then the Republican Minority Leader, Senator Everett Dirksen of Illinois, who had this to say.
There are some things that are simply incredible and leave one absolutely speechless. This is one of them. I knew John Fitzgerald Kennedy as a representative, as a senator, and as a president for 14 years or more. And my last visit with him was on Tuesday morning of this week. I went early to present him with a turkey from the Turkey Growers Association. He was so amiable, so affable, so agreeable, and he looked in the very pink of condition, notwithstanding a rather rugged tour in the state of Florida. The thing that stuck in my mind most, when suddenly he shouted to a lot of school children and to those managing this live turkey, "Don't take the turkey away until the children have had a chance to come up and see it." We visited about many things. Politics, bills pending in Congress, the future, 1964, and everything that one can encompass within a half-hour visit. And suddenly comes this mortal blow that strikes him cold in death. I say it's an incredible thing. And my heart goes out to the family. And I'm a little bewildered by this turn of events, as I know the nation and the whole wide world will be.
Everett Dirksen, Republican Minority Leader. Former President Eisenhower, who walked in the very same shadow of death for 8 years, was deeply moved. He commented,
"I share the sense of shock and dismay that the entire nation must feel at the despicable act that took the life of the nation's president. On the personal side, Mrs. Eisenhower and I share the grief that Mrs. Kennedy must now feel. And we send to her our prayerful thoughts and sympathetic sentiments in this hour.
Former President Eisenhower. Here in Philadelphia, the reaction was much as it was across the entire country and the world. There was shock intermingled with grief, and there was anger, too, and there was despair. Mayor James Tate was visibly shaken as he talked with the newsmen when word came. His first reaction was to order all city flags at half-mast. He said that all residents should pray for the late president. Speaking of the assassination itself, the mayor said this.
Against humanity itself. I regarded him, as so many other people did, as the world's leading spokesman of goodwill and tolerance and understanding for all men, of all nations, regardless of race or creed or color. He was the first Catholic president of the United States. And it looks like he paid the penalty just like Lincoln did because of his views with respect to tolerance and understanding among people. I trust his untimely death at such a young age will serve as a beacon to guide everyone in their daily lives to practice tolerance and understanding. He was truly a martyr for a great cause. It will be a great loss to his family, to this nation, to the world, and I'm sure to the Democratic Party. I trust and hope that Vice President Johnson will be able to lead us with the same kind of understanding and responsibility towards all men.
Mayor James Tate eulogizing the late President Kennedy, after which Tate, a Catholic also, went to St. John's Church there to pray for the late Chief Executive. From Governor William Scranton of Pennsylvania, these words, "This hideous crime leaves the hearts and soul of America lifeless and in sorrow. All the world is stunned to silence by this evil deed." And New Jersey Governor Richard Hughes said, "A young and fearless American has died in the service of his country. Even as many years ago, his body absorbed the wounds of battle, also in the name of freedom." Philadelphia area residents felt the shock and felt it deeply. Many of them could not even speak as WCAU's Dan Cryer sought their comments. Others spoke of the tragedy, although many had a word and a hard time choking out those words. Here's Dan Cryer's recorded reaction moments after the word came of the late president's death.
What is there to say? It's a sad state of affairs that the country has come to. Believe me, he's not only a president, he's a father and a husband and a son. It's sickening. The worst thing that has ever happened.
Well, I think it's a sad thing. It's a terrible thing. So unexpected that it's pretty hard to comment on it.
Did you ever think you'd live in your day and age to see something like this happen?
No, I did not.
In this country especially?
No, I did not. I did not.
Did you think you'd ever live to see this happen in your day and age?
No, I sure didn't. That's the good truth. It just got by me.
Well, it's a terrible thing that happened to this man. The most wonderful person in the world.
I'm very sorry. I really am. I don't know how to explain it. I feel worse by this than I did. I was in service when I heard that Roosevelt was dead.
Did you ever think you'd live to hear such a thing?
I didn't think a thing could happen in this day and time. Years ago, 100 years ago, I didn't think a thing like this could really happen.
Some of the comments from shocked Philadelphia area residents recorded at 59th and Belmont. Helpless, it seems, in their grief. Many residents brought out flags that had been in the attics and basements since Veterans Day and even the past July the 4th. As a wordless expression of their sorrow, they fixed the flag at half-mast and let that gesture, small though it may be, yet brilliant and eloquent, speak for them. At the Academy of Music, Philadelphia orchestra conductor Eugene Ormandy suddenly walked off stage. He did not return. The stunned audience was told that Ormandy suddenly stopped the music when he learned that the heart of President Kennedy had been stilled. Yes, and the stock market also had its reaction, slumping drastically at the news that President Kennedy had been murdered. The New York Exchange shut down abruptly at 2:07 this afternoon, but it was 2:56 o'clock before the tickers cleaned up to heavy sales. The final word on the ticker was close, no closing quotations. Dow Jones averages showed 30 industrials down 21.16, the 20 railroads down 328, 15 utilities down 1.95, and some 65 stocks down 6.15. Sales on the New York Exchange totaled $6,630,000. And yet, countless words will be said, far more than in dollars, at the terrific bereavement that will be suffered by this country, its citizens, as well as the citizens of the entire world. Because now, the new president, Lyndon B. Johnson, has already been installed, sworn in as he was, in the plane that brought the body of President Kennedy back to Washington. He is in the White House at the moment, Mr. Johnson, and the remains of President John F. Kennedy is on its way to Bethesda, Maryland Hospital. We have tried to bring you, from the reactions of the world, a picture of what has happened today. All of us are shocked at this tremendous thing that has happened so quickly out of a clear blue sky. And it seems that at this moment, Mrs. Jacqueline Kennedy is behaving better than any of all of us. She, too, with that tremendous inward class that she's always exposed in moments of tragedy, recently with her own baby. The way she rides a horse, perhaps, is the way that she has taken this thing. She is now with her friends, parts of her family. She was met at the plane at the Andrews Air Force Base by her brother-in-law, Robert Kennedy, who tried to assist her, but she walked alone. President Johnson is about to convene a bipartisan, or nonpartisan, I should say, meeting of the heads of Congress, the various department heads, who will be talking to the president, the new president, who will be wishing him well, praying for the success as he now begins to steer the ship of state of America. The president of the Columbia Broadcasting Company, ladies and gentlemen, has announced that both the radio network and the television network will refrain from any entertainment broadcast or any commercial announcements or messages whatsoever between now and the time President Kennedy is buried. This will continue throughout that length of time. This is John Facenda speaking from WCAU in Philadelphia.
All regular programming on CBS Radio and WCAU Radio has been suspended. We will continue to broadcast further reports concerning the death of President John F. Kennedy.